Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change. Matt, nice to meet you, man. Thank you so much for joining us on Changing the Climate.
Great. Thanks for inviting me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
As am I. Should be a good one. My pleasure every single week. And of course, we always love to get the show started with a little bit of background on who you are, how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Matt Fromer. I work for an organization. It's a nonprofit called the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP. We are based in Boulder and Denver. We work in 5 states in the Southwest. That's Colorado, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. And we work on energy efficiency and clean transportation policy. So at the state level, local level, we do a lot of work with electric utilities and the Public Utilities Commission, with transit agencies trying to electrify buses and get more bus service, transit service out there. And generally just try to improve transportation system efficiency and reduce pollution.
Very cool. Let's go into the origin story. How'd you get involved with the company? Why are you interested in that stuff? Where are you from? All that kind of fun stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So from the East Coast, I actually studied architecture undergrad, went to Michigan, and then I was building university buildings, basically. Did a stint overseas, actually, in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Because I graduated into the recession and there were no jobs in the US. So I took a job overseas, basically building skyscrapers. Then moved back, was living in Manhattan for a while, building sort of residential towers, luxury buildings, which was really fun. I got to learn a lot about the city, about zoning and land use. I wasn't fully satisfied in that role, I'd say. Partially because I was building apartments basically for very wealthy people. That's kind of what the market incentivizes. And I'd finish these buildings and then go walk by at night and kind of none of the lights were on. I kind of noticed that people were buying these properties to park their money and weren't necessarily living there. And I was also at the same time noticing we were sort of entering a bit of a housing crisis. And so I started thinking more about policy and zoning and about who decides what we build and where, and how housing and transportation and climate and all these things are interrelated, and ended up actually transitioning more into policy and planning. It actually took me out of New York, out to Colorado, where I went to grad school at CU Boulder. Studied sustainable planning and management. And it was in grad school that I got into transportation, was sort of fascinated by this future of transportation where we've got sort of a convergence of electric vehicles, potentially autonomous vehicles, and we call shared mobility, like this sort of Uber, Lyft. Now we got the rise of Amazon Prime and these on-demand delivery services and what that could mean for transportation system, for climate, and so that brought me to work at SWEEP, and I've been there now for going on 4 years, and it's been really exciting to work in the space. Got a lot of great partners in Colorado, and the coalition grows every day, and we've been able to get quite a bit done with the Polis administration, so it's exciting.
Very cool stuff, man. You say potentially autonomous. Don't you think it's an inevitability, man, with what Tesla's doing and stuff? I mean, I don't know where you stand. It seems like the older generation, they like having their hand on the wheel and controlling things. Me, I'm ready to hop into the back of a car and go to sleep and then just drive somewhere. So I'm ready for the full autonomy.
Yeah. I would say when I was studying this in 2016 in grad school, we were convinced that autonomous vehicles were coming in 2017. And we were scrambling to get the policy pieces in place. Of course, now it's 5 years later and we don't have autonomous vehicles on the road, save for a few pilots in Scottsdale, Arizona. I think it's much more complicated than we thought, especially in urban environments. And I think also when we took a closer look at Uber and Lyft, which basically are sort of paving the way toward autonomous vehicles, I would say, sort of the combination of autonomous and rideshare, which could potentially replace personal vehicle ownership and bring some benefits to society. But there's also sort of this like dystopian scenario where we have like robot cars driving all over the place. Half of them are empty, and you're stuck in traffic because people would rather send their autonomous vehicle to circle the block instead of pay $7 an hour to park it. So I think there's some policy pieces we need to think through there with autonomous vehicles and whether they're actually delivering on those benefits in terms of pollution, in terms of like transportation access, air quality benefits. Equity is a big one. Who gets to access the autonomous vehicles, and as well as who owns them, who operates them, and those sorts of things. So I think we'll work out the kinks. But I mean, like I said, it's not coming on as quickly as we might have thought 5 years ago, at least in our cities.
Yeah. I'm trying to piece together what you said about like building giant buildings for like rich people, how you went from like studying something where you were like creating stuff to more like policy. And I guess I'm sensing like the ability for you to like impact the everyman rather than like, if you know what's compensated the best would be creating those luxury buildings, but when you work in policy you can actually help the little guy with what you're doing. I don't know, I'm trying to figure out where you went from like creation to like legislation in your head.
Yes. I kind of skipped over one piece there, which was one of my experiences was I'd moved from New York City out to Vail, Colorado, essentially to like ski for a season. And I was working for an architect in Vail, kind of part-time. And the projects we were doing were like very, very nice ski homes, like on the mountain and multi-million-dollar houses, basically like blank checks. I mean, I'd like call these these homeowners and tell them, hey, we need to like expand the backyard to fit this jacuzzi. It's going to cost an extra like 200K. Like, oh, totally cool. And we finished the home, and I would learn that the owner actually lived in Houston. This is one of 5 homes, and they're really only spending like 1 or 2 weeks in Vail a year. They're also not renting out this home because they're like, I don't want anyone else living in my house. So it's sitting there empty, and at the same time, I'm making friends in Vail. A lot of them sort of in the lifties and working in the ski shops, who cannot afford to live in Vail or even 1 or 2 towns over. I mean, we got people driving from like renting in Leadville and then driving to Vail every day on a dangerous mountain pass because they can't afford to work and live in Vail. There isn't enough workforce housing. And so it really got me thinking about this like dynamic, basically like these very wealthy, sort of elitist resort towns that are depending on the workforce to service them, but not allowing them to live there, sort of separating that. And it kind of activated me and sort of got me thinking about housing affordability and land use, and got me involved in sort of the movement to build more affordable housing.
Yeah.
And that's also all wrapped up in climate, right? And we could talk about this a little bit with, you think about Boulder as well, where we're adding jobs to a community without adding a proportional amount of housing. And when you're hiring people without housing them, you're pushing them out of the community to live further and further away, which from a climate perspective adds emissions. It adds vehicle miles traveled, and it adds transportation pollution to the system. So there's this sort of transportation and land use are inextricably linked in that way. And if we want to get at transportation pollution, we've also got to think about housing and the housing jobs balance.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely the case with the increased emissions with more people traveling. There's no argument against that, I don't think. And we've talked about this topic on the show a fair amount. And I'd like to get into it with you as well, because I don't see a clear solution that makes sense for everyone. So I understand the idea that it seems kind of weird that this wealthy person has a 2,000 square foot plot of livable space that's only being used 2 weeks of the year. You think to yourself, that doesn't make sense. But at the same time, we have this free market economic system that's in place that is valuing assets based on what they're worth, and people who have the money to afford them can buy them. So it seems fair and free, but then you get results like this where you've got poor people not able to live in the places that they work. I don't have a simple answer to that, and regardless of the fact of whether or not that I'm the climate change realtor and I'm all about positive environmental impacts, I still want a realistic solution that people can actually adopt on both sides of the aisle, whether it be politically or economically. And I don't know what the answer to this issue would be. Does that mean that we it designates certain homes in the city to be affordable? That's what we do in Boulder. Or do we actually change the market so people can't buy space and not use it? That seems kind of like draconian to do that. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's certainly complex. I would argue that we do not have a free market when it comes to housing, that we actually over-regulate on zoning and land use. If you take the example of, you look at most residential districts in Boulder and actually in Colorado, the majority of them are zoned for single family, meaning one dwelling unit per parcel, right? So that means if I bought a house in Boulder, and just a single family home on a lot, and I wanted to put up a wall in the middle, create a duplex, right, and rent out the other half, and basically double the density there, that's illegal, right? You can't add 2 units, 3, 4. I mean, you can add accessory dwelling units. Boulder did update that policy a couple of years ago, that it is pretty restrictive. It's not every home. It's only a few on the block, and you've got to have parking and these sorts of things. But we're not allowing the free market to really drive the type of density that would improve affordability, and that would reduce emissions by adding more people into walkable communities where they don't have to drive everywhere, right? So we are seeing some movement in other states. So in Oregon, for example, we've got the city of Portland. They actually banned single family zoning. So now in single family zone districts in Portland, you can build 2, 3, up to 4 units on that property. And that does really improve density. And I think density is become this bad word that people are afraid of, especially in Boulder. Like, people think we were trying to build skyscrapers in front of the Flatirons. That's not what we're saying. It has to be more nuanced than that. And really what we're talking about is gentle density, right? So allowing up to 4 units, not forcing it on anyone, but if you do own that land, you can make a decision as a homeowner to build a duplex if you want to. That's fine. And then I think you'd want to think about specifically neighborhoods around high frequency transit stations. Like if you think about downtown Boulder, you think about Boulder Junction, really along 28th there. Similarly, if you think about Denver along Broadway or Federal or Colfax, all of those have 15-minute bus or light rail service. And so within, say, quarter mile of that transit station, that's really where we want to be putting people and allowing greater density. And you could put some numbers on that. You could say a 5-story building, maybe 20% of it's affordable housing. And even better, if you give everyone in that building an eco pass and limit the parking supply. And that really allows them, if they want to live a more car-free lifestyle with lower vehicle miles traveled, lower greenhouse gas emissions. But right now, I'd say we're over-regulating the housing market. And you could see this play out with low transit ridership, right? We invested all this money in RTD to build out light rail, to build out bus service, but we did not allow density around the train stations, around the bus stations. And so ridership remains pretty low. You can get off at a light rail stop east of Denver. It's in a warehouse district. It's in no man's land, right? So if you really were thinking about transportation and land use together, you'd plan for that, and it would have implications for both zoning and housing.
Do you not just think that ridership is low because riding the bus sucks and people are weird on the bus?
um, uh, I'm one of those weirdos on the bus, I guess. No,
I didn't mean
I
to
mean,
like
yeah,
broadly like generalize,
yeah,
but like I lived like the bus
yeah,
life in Australia and it was definitely different. But like in the US, I
yeah.
don't know. Like I've ridden the bus home from like what's it called? Grand Central Station in New York or no, Port Authority. I mean, when you have a
Right.
choice, if you have a car, which is like taking the bus versus driving, like yes, the environmental impacts are worse when you drive, but it's a more comfortable, luxurious experience. Don't you think some people prefer that? I mean, not, of course some people do, but like I don't know how much of a
Mhm.
factor that is compared to like convenience and where you live kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not even giving people the option today, right?
Right.
Like that's assuming that it takes the same amount of time, costs me the same amount of money, feels safe, is convenient to either drive or take the bus, and then you're choosing between equal modes of transportation. That's not true today, right? If I want to get across town in Denver, it might take me 15 minutes in a car and an hour and a half on three different buses, right? And it's going to cost me
Wow.
say $3, $4, but $6 to get over there on a bus when I've already have this sunken cost of a car. I've already paid for it, right? And so just when I'm making that decision, obviously I'm going to choose a car. And then to add on top of it, not only is it three buses to get across town, but it's unreliable. They may not come on time, right? I just took a trip across town 2 days ago, and I had to get basically it was two buses. It was one to the middle of Denver and then one to North Denver. The first bus came 4 minutes late. I missed the connector bus. I realized I was going to be late for this meeting, so I ended up hopping in an Uber. That Uber cost me $24 and got there late anyway because I was stuck in traffic. So the system is really broken, right? We're not giving people equal mobility options between different modes, right? We don't have enough bike lanes for people to get across town and feel safe doing so. We don't have enough transit service for that to be a reliable and convenient and affordable option. So I think we're a long way from that. I mean, certainly people can choose to drive if they want to, but that's like the only choice right now. And
Yeah.
frankly, it's the most polluting choice, and it's hugely expensive. I mean, it costs the average American $10,000 a year to own a car.
Whoa.
It doesn't have to be that way, right? I think a lot of people move to Denver or Boulder or other parts of Colorado from places that have good transit, whether that be in the U.S. or overseas, and they move to the city. They say, okay, I don't need a car. I'm living in a city, and then they realize we don't have good transit service. I actually need a car to get around, and that frustrates a lot of people, and it also like hurts our wallets.
Yeah.
It's hugely expensive. It's expensive for all of us, but especially if you look at sort of the lower quintile of earners. Like if you look at the lowest fifth of earners, they're spending like a third of their income just on transportation costs,
Wow.
and that's crazy. And they're spending even more than that on housing. There's nothing left over, right? And so I think we're putting people in a really tough position. I would argue that transit should really be a public good. I mean, there's so many benefits that come along with it, not only from pollution, but in terms of access to jobs, helping people save money on household and transportation costs. And so I think we got to get to a place where we're like comparing it to cars to like it should really be a public good where it's free, it's ubiquitous, it's convenient, it's reliable, and people can use it to get around if they want to.
That would be pretty awesome. You know what? I take it back. I lived in Sydney for a whole year and I rode the bus the entire year. And I never once had any negative interactions or any like weird people that made me feel uncomfortable in Sydney. It's this America where you get crazy people on the bus. Like I know people
Yeah,
who have like been stabbed on the bus and stuff. Like so that's there in this country, which doesn't help with the transition. But yeah, that's just my personal anecdotes. Let's get into talking about the
yeah.
Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. So well, like what do you do on a day-to-day basis? Like what is the goal of the organization, all that stuff?
Sure, yeah. So we advocate for energy efficiency and clean transportation policy at the state level. So we work on a lot of legislation in our 5 states. I've done a lot
Which
of work
are
on which are Colorado, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Love it.
So pretty good mix there. We got with three blue, two red states, and they're all different. Very, very interesting cross section politically. But we're seeing a lot of opportunity, not only in Colorado, but increasingly so in Nevada, New Mexico, and even in Arizona and Utah as well. So yeah, we work on a lot of legislation. I've done a lot on electric vehicles. So working through like what are the major barriers to buy an electric vehicle? We think about the sort of upfront cost of an electric vehicle or EV versus a gas car. We think about the charging infrastructure, making sure it's convenient and affordable for people to charge these things, people making sure they understand as we like sort of shift the paradigm from refueling at a gas station to basically recharging your car at home, plugging it in overnight like a smartphone. And so we've worked on state policies like the Colorado EV tax credit. We worked on Xcel Energy now, our big electric utility in Colorado, now has charging incentive programs. So for single family homes, multifamily homes, businesses, they can take advantage of these incentives if they want to build EV charging stations for themselves, for their employees, for the public. Those are just rolling out this year, so that's really exciting. And then, I think the other thing we worked on, the big thing this year was Senate Bill 260, which basically is going to raise about $5.5 billion for transportation funding. Included in that $5.5 billion is about $750 million for transportation electrification. We're going to use that money to build more charging stations, to replace diesel school buses and transit buses with electric buses.
Who's we? Is that the state of Colorado?
That's the state, not state. But that's public investment in basically transitioning from gasoline and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. And then when we think about sort of our climate targets, so in 2019, Colorado, the legislature passed House Bill 1261, which sets greenhouse gas reduction goals. And the goal by 2030 is to basically cut greenhouse gas pollution in half.
Excellent.
So, and that's economy wide. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in our state. It's about a third of all emissions. And then when we sort of break down transportation and think about how you might cut some of that pollution by 2030, about 3/4 of those reductions will come from electric vehicles and more fuel efficient vehicles as we get it to higher, like 30, 40 miles per gallon for gas cars. The remaining quarter basically needs to come from reductions in vehicle trips, vehicle travel. So instead of driving, 11,000 miles a year, that's the average for Coloradans, I think we need to get closer to 10,000, 9,500. And doing so by either mode shifting, so replacing vehicle trips with transit, biking, walking, but also with better land use. So if we can put housing closer to jobs, grocery stores, schools, hospitals, and make that driving commute, 15 miles instead of 20 miles, that sort of gets at the problem too, just reducing those vehicle miles traveled.
So these goals are not just for like the state utility. This is like for the people need to like adopt these policies as well for it to actually work. We need to drive less.
I think it goes back to the mobility options, right? As right now, like the only choice is driving. And that's why in Colorado, we have higher VMT or vehicle miles traveled on average than the national average.
It's a big state.
It's a big state, yeah. We also just don't have good transit service. Like it should be easy to get to all the ski resorts on a bus. We're getting there, but it's really not, right? We don't have good transit. We're also just sprawling like crazy. If you look right now at the Denver metro area, about 3/4 of new development is taking place sort of east of Denver in the wildlands in the Arapahoe, Adams, Douglas County areas. And it's basically just sort of homogeneous residential suburbs without access to like commercial facilities like, schools, hospitals. I guess there's schools out there, but there aren't really job centers out there. You're basically building residential suburbs and people have to get on the highway and commute instead of, be in Denver and have options to get around.
I wonder if it's probably most important what like the middle class majority of people are doing rather than what like the extenuating circumstances of like the wealthy person who has a house in California, Colorado, and Texas and drives between all three. It's probably these big what's the word, like societal changes is not really focused on them. It's focused on the majority of the emissions are probably made, I guess, like large corporations make a lot of emissions, but when it comes to like the individual level, it's probably the majority of the population that has the biggest impact. So we can get people to kind of all live in the same area, we can bring that down. That's interesting. I'm trying to think about how we could actually meet this emissions target for 2030, because it would be nice to have like actual backstops so we like successfully accomplish it. When it comes to like specific policy around EVs, what are you like bullish on, like, or what are you trying to promote?
On electric vehicles, I think
in particular,
I think we need to bring down the upfront cost. Right now, EVs are $5,000 to $10,000 more expensive than a gas car. Now, if you look at the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle, it's lower over time, right? Because you're spending less on fuel, you're spending less on maintenance. For example, you're just charging an electric vehicle costs you about 80 cents per gallon equivalent. So instead of spending like $3.50 a gallon, you're spending 80 cents a gallon, and you're saving about $1,000 a year versus a gas car.
People like that.
If you look at maintenance, it costs about half what it costs to repair a gas car. You got regenerative braking, so you don't need to replace the brakes very often. No oil changes, no spark plugs, none of that. There's only like 20 parts in an EV. It's a very simple technology. So you're really just paying to like rotate the tires. So there are like economic benefits in terms of total cost of ownership, but I think we need to lower that upfront barrier of like actually buying one. We do see that EVs are becoming more cost competitive with gas cars. If you think about just 10 years ago, the cost of a battery, I think it was about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So if you think about, say, a Nissan Leaf or a Chevy Bolt with a 60 kilowatt hour battery pack, that battery pack alone costs like $60,000 10 years ago. Now we're getting that cost closer to like $100 per kilowatt hour, like 10% of that cost. So that same battery pack that cost $60,000 10 years ago costs $6,000 today, right? And that sort of learning curve just continues, right?
Economies of scale.
It's unbelievable, right? It's unbelievable.
It's awesome.
I think we're going to see that continue. And you look at sort of like McKinsey and a lot of these reports coming from the experts, they're expecting sort of cost parity between EVs and gas cars in the sort of 2024, 2025 timeframe. That's without tax credits. If you throw on the tax credits, right, we've got a $7,500 federal tax credit, $2,500 Colorado state tax credit, then it's cheaper on day one and you're just saving money immediately. So I think the economic argument's certainly there. When you think about other barriers to electric vehicles, people really get freaked out about the range. Today you can get an EV with 250, 300 miles of range on it, which like does scare people because they're used to driving a gas car that has 400 or 500 miles of range and having access to gas stations all over the place. But we are building out more fast charging stations. The state actually has a deal with ChargePoint right now. ChargePoint is one of the biggest EV charging providers to build 34 public fast charging stations around the state. And they've opened about half of them. So today, I mean, I own a Nissan Leaf. And when I bought it, I was planning trips out to like Crested Butte and realizing that I couldn't really get there because I didn't have enough charging. As of earlier this year, they finally opened fast chargers in Fairplay, Salida, Buena Vista, Crested Butte. So I have options. I mean, I could charge. Usually, I only need one charge on the way there, one charge on the way back. But now those charging stations are open. I can basically drive anywhere in the state with my Leaf. It's got 230 miles range. Pull over for 30 or 40 minutes here and there and top off. But it's a totally different world than it was even a year ago. And I think we'll probably have double the number of chargers by this time next year. So I think the state's doing a lot to address that. And we're starting to also see private sector money come in and build out those charging stations as more people have EVs and there's a stronger business case.
Yo, I'm loving having you on right now. Like, I didn't know any of this. What I am thinking about is like, I've got this 2007 Honda Accord that was a gift to me, and as much as I want to wrap my car and have my face on it so everyone can see Climate Change Realty when I drive around Boulder, but I'm like, oh, it's a gas car, that sucks. But like the financial incentive to like not change the car is huge. It's a 2007, but it has like 87,000 miles on it. This car is going to last forever. So I guess what I'm wondering is what percentage of like the cars on the road are like turning over each year, and then like what percentage is becoming EVs, and like should we even want to increase that number because there's all this junk and scrap metal and stuff? That's what are we going to do with all that? That topic.
Really good questions. Yeah. So there are, I think, 5.3 million cars in Colorado, and we buy about 200,000 every year. So I don't know what that translates to. Maybe it's like 6% or something fleet turnover, meaning it's going to take a long time to transition the whole fleet over to electric. Yeah. So, and today I think the number is about 6% of new cars are electric, which is really good. I think we're ranked 5th or 6th in the nation as a state in terms of electric vehicle market share, like as a percentage of new sales. So we're doing really well. Most of those EVs are purchased by wealthier individuals. I mean, Tesla's dominating the market. It's like 2/3 of EV sales right now. And then you've got these higher end other cars, from Audi, from BMW, Mercedes, that are more expensive. Rivian's now coming out with their electric pickup truck and electric SUV, but that's going to be $70,000, $80,000. So, I mean, like with any new technology, I think it's going to be available to wealthy people before the masses, but we are seeing more like affordable EVs come online. I mean, the Nissan Leaf, I think, is $31,000 for the long range one. And again, you get a $10,000 tax credit, which brings that down to $21,000. You can lease it for like, I think, $320 a month, which is what I chose to do. And that made sense for me. But yeah, I hear your story a lot.
I'm paying zero.
Hey, I know.
I'm paying insurance.
Right. You're paying insurance. I mean, I wonder how much you pay to repair the car every year. Because
it's a Honda, dude.
Not much.
It's a Honda. I mean, I don't know what else to say. You change the oil, you don't crash into other people, you do pretty well.
Yeah.
I have the brakes, brake pad, but I'm sure you have to replace brake pads on electric vehicles as well now.
I've spent in 18 months, I've spent $35 on maintenance. So, I mean, I think it's all these hidden costs that you don't necessarily think about that start to make sense. But I mean, you're right. I think a lot of people, there's some stats on this, like surveys done by AAA, about like a third of people, want their next car to be an EV, but they're not quite ready to go there. And frankly, most people want a used car. They're not going to buy a new. And so we need enough new cars in the pipeline and then sort of passing down into the used car market to then make them more affordable. And that's starting to happen. I mean, it's going to happen with time. But I mean, you're really highlighting here why we also need to like couple electrification with like strategies like transit, because we just can't do it fast enough with electric vehicles. We're not going to retire the fleet quickly enough, and the turnover's too slow. Like even at the point we get to 100% of new cars are electric, it's still going to take that 15, 17 years to fully decarbonize the fleet, right? So we've got to think about complementary strategies like smart land use, transit investments, bikes, walkable cities, all these good things.
Well, where do you think like companies like Uber and like other ride sharing companies will come into play with this kind of thing?
It's a good question. And it's really important because Uber and Lyft cars drive about 5 miles, sorry, 5 times more than personally owned vehicles. So you and I might put 11, 12,000 miles per year on our cars. An Uber driver might put 60,000 miles on, right? So if replacing an Uber car is with an EV is basically worth replacing like 5 personally owned vehicles.
That's a great point.
So it's really important that we go after Uber and Lyft. And then also, I mean, there's benefits for them too, right? Like if the cost savings is on a per mile basis, right? If they're spending sort of 5 cents a mile on electricity versus 15 cents a mile for gasoline, and you're driving 5 times further, the cost benefits are even higher. Like they might spend $7,000 a year on gas, but only $1,500 a year on electricity, something like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We have been putting a lot of pressure. I mean, we as an environmental community, putting a lot of pressure on Uber and Lyft because studies have come out showing that they're really increasing traffic and pollution because they're driving around without passengers a lot of the time, right? There's this concept of deadheading where an Uber has to travel to a location to pick someone up, go drop them off, drive to another location to pick someone up. And that's all of those like interstitial trips that add pollution and add miles traveled. And so there's some good data on this now. They're basically each Uber trip increases pollution by about 70% compared to a personally owned vehicle trip. Right. So, and that's happening in cities around the country. So we've sort of taken that data, put some more pressure on Uber and Lyft. They've responded by making some pretty good commitments. Lyft wants to electrify their fleet by 2030. So that's 9 years from now. Interesting to think about how they might do that since they don't really own many of the vehicles on their service, right? They're contracting that out. So they are thinking about ways to get EVs out into the system. They actually did buy quite a few electric vehicles. I think they bought a fleet of Hyundai Kona EVs in Denver, and they're offering those as rentals to drivers and building charging stations so they can help, and maybe even giving people charging stations at home so they can charge them there. So interesting pilots like that. And then there's an increasing focus on sort of tying Uber and Lyft into transit and figuring out how they might be complementary. Like, for example, if I live, say, 2 miles from a light rail stop, a little far to walk, but maybe I take an
Scooter.
Uber to the transit stop. That'd be great. If I had a scooter, I would. But
No, the Lyft scooters, they have those in Denver, don't they?
Right. Yes.
Those are electric.
They're becoming mobility companies, right? Not just cars anymore, but they've got scooters. They've now got electric bikes, like dockless bikes, all these good things. So really like expanding the concept of Uber and Lyft to think about multimodal and how it links with transit. Another thing is we have like an RTD, the regional transit district in Denver. It's a huge, huge footprint, right? All these cities, counties, suburbs. Some of these suburbs don't really have the density to support a bus route, right? They're driving through single family neighborhoods. There's hardly anyone on the bus. So we're starting to think about smaller vehicles like micro transit. You might run a shuttle, but at a certain point, it makes sense to maybe just subsidize an Uber or Lyft trip, especially for lower income communities, to give them greater access to the transit service. If we're paying like, I don't know, $40 or $50 per passenger for bus service, you can certainly save money subsidizing an Uber trip in most cases. So I think that the future will likely see greater integration between transit agencies and some of these Ubers, Lyfts, micro mobility services, and using that to like really reduce vehicle trips and pollution.
I think just generally speaking, the more we work together on anything, we we do a better job. Speaking of which, shout out Duncan Gilchrist. Matt, you're an awesome guy to have on the show. I appreciate Duncan recommending me speak to
Yeah,
you. Curious what your like day-to-day workflow looks like on these like different policy projects you're working on at Sweep.
sure, sure. Um, yeah, I mean, we say yes to a lot. So it's everything from working with Xcel Energy on the design of their electric vehicle charging programs to working with local government, like City of Longmont now is setting some pretty bold electric vehicle targets, to working with state legislators as they think about policies that reduce transportation pollution. Doing a lot of work with CDOT now. CDOT's got their 10-year plan of projects, but they're also rolling out what they're calling a greenhouse gas planning rule.
What is
Basically
CDOT?
set. Sorry, I'm using a lot of acronyms, so please stop me and I'll
I
unpack
got
them.
you.
But CDOT is the Colorado Department of Transportation.
Excellent.
So basically responsible for spending about $2.5 billion a year on transportation infrastructure. And that's where our sort of gas taxes go, fair amount of money from the general fund, about to be a lot of money from the federal government. So CDOT traditionally has spent most of their money on highways and highway expansion. You think about I-70, I-25, I-270. CDOT actually used to be called the Colorado Department of Highways. And then in 1991, about 30 years ago, they changed their name to the Colorado Department of Transportation and started to talk about, other modes of transportation, not just cars. They didn't really change their policies at that point. It's taken some time, but I think with this new administration, new leadership at CDOT, they're starting to really think critically about how they might support other modes instead of just widening highways. I think also we have a lot of new research now showing that when you add a lane of highway in the name of congestion relief, it actually just generates more traffic and more pollution. And so they really justify these highway widening projects by saying, we're going to get rid of traffic, which is true temporarily. But all the studies suggest that within 3 to 5 years, that new lane just fills up with traffic and you're stuck with the same congestion. And
Now
so
you
it creates this reinforcing feedback loop of you have traffic, so you build a lane, and then it encourages more people to drive more trips, further distances. You have more traffic. Okay, we should add another lane. And that's how you get 24 lane wide freeways like you have in Texas and Houston. And they're still congested, right? And they want to widen it, of course. And so I think, it's a broken system, and I'm glad we're starting to think about other solutions, like maybe taking one lane and putting rapid transit in there, like we have the Flatiron Flyer on US 36. And that really does go a long way to actually reduce congestion. And now we're opening up the conversation to talk about land use as well, so that we're not putting everything so far away from where you live.
Yeah, I had Ian Tafoya on the show, and he was talking about the exact same thing. And I
Awesome.
asked him this question. I wonder if are you familiar with the Boring Company?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I love that idea. Building tunnels and then just having people go through the tunnels instead of having like highways and roads. It seems like it would make a lot more sense to me. So it at least. You're versed in the stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I agree with it. I think it's I know like Las Vegas is building, like partnering with Tesla now, and they have a boring project. They basically built a tunnel and they're shuttling Teslas through the tunnel. I mean, I think they're kind of reinventing the subway by a different name. We figured this out like 120 years ago in New York City. We just haven't adequately funded it and rolled it out in every city. It is just much less efficient to be in a single occupancy vehicle in the tunnel versus a train or a bus. And so I'm not like super high on Boring Company. I think
No
it'd be
worries.
nice if it brought down the cost of building new transit. If you want to build below grade light rail or train service, It's super expensive in this country to do that, and it takes a long time. So if Boring Company could figure out a way to bring down those costs and then partner with transit agencies to get more service out there, that would be great. But I think having it like exclusive to Tesla owners isn't a great look. And
Oh,
so
really? Is that what they're doing in Vegas?
my understanding is, yeah, it's Tesla's, only Teslas can use the service, and it's basically pedestrians coming down into what basically looks like a subway stop, and then they have Teslas there to shuttle you through the tunnel to the other side of the convention center. I
Just like
mean,
Apple, they're making a Tesla only economy. Very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. But yeah, I just love to ask. I like to look into the high tech crazy ideas. Speaking of which, why do you? I had read something. I don't know if it was like you were interviewed or an article that you wrote where you said that it's important to advocate like a broad suite of public benefits without being tied to like one solution. I just wanted to kind of ask you your thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, at Sweep, because we work in a very diverse region politically, we do look at all the benefits, and you have to talk about it in different ways. Frankly, like in Colorado, we have climate targets, we've got air quality goals. Right, we're in a non-attainment area for ozone, and that's a serious problem. If you go to Arizona, you can't really talk about climate in the same way. Um, and they do have air quality issues, but in different venues, we like to talk about different benefits. So when we talk about electric vehicle policy in Colorado, I like to highlight the climate benefits. We talk about the social cost of carbon, right? Like dealing with climate change later is hugely expensive, right? Like billions and billions of dollars. So preventing that pollution now will save us a lot of money as a society, and more than justifies really any of these climate policies. But we include that in policies. If a certain electric vehicle policy will reduce X tons of carbon pollution, you can apply a dollar amount to that, say $50, $75, and come up with an economic benefit for that policy. That's the way we might talk about it in Colorado or Nevada, for example. When we go to Arizona or Utah, I like to shift a little bit to the economic benefits, right? People are paying way too much on gasoline and diesel. We're giving this all to oil companies. In the case of Nevada, they don't have any oil wells or oil refineries in state. So all of that money is leaving the state. Whereas if they switch to electric, they have electric utilities and it will stay within the state, right? Not only will consumers save money switching to electricity and fueling their vehicles for less, but also what they do pay in electricity will stay in the economy. And they're going to have to build more wind and solar, which Nevada has abundant solar and wind resources. And that all generates economic activity in the state of Nevada. So that's the way we kind of talk about it, different benefits in different venues.
Awesome, man. I really appreciate what you're doing. It's some cool stuff. Has a lot of broad implications as well. Like you could really have a nice big positive impact if people actually listen and make changes that make their lives not only more efficient and better for the climate, but just like you said, like have a huge economic benefit. So it seems like it's just a no-brainer, but that's of course how you got to phrase it. Can you think of any countries that are really great at demonstrating the future of like clean transportation, like anything we can like emulate?
Yeah, well, so a lot of people point to Norway on
Been
electric
there.
vehicles.
A lot of
Yeah.
Teslas, man.
Oh,
They're all Tesla out
yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. I just looked at the latest numbers. They're about 85% EV market share. 85% of new cars are electric. Unbelievable.
It's a
We're
cool
trying to
pace.
get there like basically by 2033, I'd say. We're on track right now. So Norway's way ahead of the curve. They've done it with incentives. But the other piece of that is like just the supply. Like we need a better global supply of electric vehicles. They've had incentives in place for 10 years, but only recently has the market really taken off as the Tesla Model 3 came online, as the new Volkswagen ID4, all these like new EVs that really fit the market. When I think about EVs, I think about Norway. I also like you got to give kudos to California. Um, like adopting a California policy does freak a lot of other states out, but they've really led the world on climate policy, and it's the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. They basically from the Clean Air Act started to roll out all of these policies, sector specific policies to cut pollution. So on the transportation side, they've got this really important policy called the Zero Emission Vehicle Standard, or the ZEV standard, which requires car companies to basically sell EVs in their state. And I think it's about 10 years old. And it's really the only reason we have EVs in this country is that one policy. Now 15 other states have adopted that policy. And when China went to think about electric vehicles and what policies might encourage adoption, they looked at the California ZEV standard and adopted something very similar, as did the EU. So I think there's a lot of really great climate policy thinking that's originated in California. I would also say that Colorado's starting to catch up with California on some of these things. We don't have cap and trade or anything, but in transportation, we've now adopted the low emission vehicle standard, zero emission vehicle standard. We're now looking at diesel trucks and electric trucks. But I think we're starting to like sort of make a name for ourselves as a state when it comes to climate policy, particularly with this CDOT rule. It's really like one of the sort of leading transportation planning policies in the country. So I'm excited to see where that goes. And I think a lot of other states are watching and learning from each other and sort of using state policy as like a laboratory to then elevate to the national level.
Love that. That's awesome. You're making me want to talk to some more people from California. I mean, I've spent very little time there. I really don't know too much about the state at all. It'd definitely be interesting to talk to some people doing some cool stuff out there. But man, that's a big wild house out there. It's like, one of the biggest economies in the world, lots of people, crazy stuff. I mean, they led the world on cannabis as well. They legalized cannabis in 1996, I think, for medical use at least. So yeah,
Wow.
they're trailblazing, but happy to be in Colorado as well. Same kind of
Mm.
stuff. Matt, it's been a real pleasure, man. I really appreciate what you're doing and where your head's at, and the happy, positive attitude doesn't hurt at all as well. My last question is any advice you have for young people who are passionate about working at places that can make an impact?
Oh man, I get this question all the time. Um, yeah, there are so many smart people out there that want to work on climate, and I wish we had like a state job recruiter service to get people plugged into climate related work. Because there's so many avenues, right? It's just like we need to cut pollution out of the whole economy, like buildings, transportation, industry, agriculture, all of it. It really touches everything. And so you've set up a practice that's like real estate, but focused on climate. I really think it touches so many things. And I really encourage people to get into it. I think there's going to be more and more opportunity, particularly as the federal government rolls out some of these climate investments. And if they're going to spend $3.5 trillion of this budget reconciliation package, and a big chunk of that is climate programs, that's going to sort of stimulate a lot of climate jobs. And it's everything, right? We've got millions of buildings in this country that we need to retrofit with energy efficient technology, and we got to build electric vehicles. There's just so much innovation that needs to happen at every level. I don't know if I have like great advice, but I would just like encourage people to kind of
Do it.
stick on that path and keep looking. And if you want to call me and talk about it, I'm here. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, I sort of like found my way this circuitous path. I never thought I ended up what I'm doing now. But yeah, if you like push hard enough and talk to enough people, opportunities appear.
Yeah, same to me. I'm happy to help anyone who's looking to kind of find their way. And yeah, we'll leave your contact information in the description. Matt, like, thanks so much for coming on, man. It meant the world to me. Great to hear about what you're doing. I hope we can all continue to collaborate and push some positive change forward.
Right on. Thanks for doing this, Ethan.
My pleasure. All right, everybody. And of course, we will see you next week. Have a great day. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Changing the Climate. Here at Climate Change Realty, we don't just donate 50% of our net commissions to fight climate change, we also donate a full 50% of our real estate referrals. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.